Story 1: The Whistler in Blackwood Forest. It was a warm summer night in 2015 when Jenna, her brother Luke, and their cousin Rob decided to camp in the heart of Blackwood Forest, a dense woodland known for its towering pines and eerie silence. They had all heard stories about strange occurrences in the area, but they dismissed them as local legends. After all, what was a camping trip without a little thrill? They set up their tents in a small clearing surrounded by tall trees. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the forest became alive with the sounds of nocturnal creatures. Crickets chirped in unison, and an owl hooted somewhere far away. The three gathered around the campfire, roasting marshmallows and telling ghost stories, laughing off any fear that tried to creep in. As midnight approached, the fire began to die down, and with it, the forest grew unnervingly quiet. The usual hum of insects faded, leaving only the rustling of leaves in the gentle breeze. Rob was the first to notice the faint whistling. "Do you guys hear that?" he asked, his voice low and cautious. Jenna and Luke paused, straining their ears. Sure enough, there it was, a distant, almost melodic whistling coming from the darkness beyond the firelight. It wasn't a tune they recognized, and the longer they listened, the more unnatural it seemed. The sound wasn't constant. It would start and stop as if whoever was whistling was moving. "Probably just the wind," Luke shrugged, though his eyes darted nervously around the clearing. But the whistling grew louder, closer, cutting through the air like a knife. It seemed to circle them, moving from one direction to another, as if something, or someone, was lurking just beyond their sight, watching. "I don't like this," Jenna muttered, her grip tightening on her flashlight. "We should go inside the tents." Rob stood up, scanning the dark woods. "No way. I want to see what it is." Against their better judgment, they all grabbed their flashlights and ventured just beyond the edge of the clearing, the whistling now loud enough to send chills down their spines. The beams of their flashlights cut through the trees, but the thick underbrush blocked their view. They couldn't see anyone, but the whistling persisted, growing even more erratic. Suddenly, the whistling stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. Just as they were about to turn back, a figure emerged from the shadows, tall, gaunt, and cloaked in black. Its face was pale, almost skeletal, and its eyes glowed faintly in the darkness. Without making a sound, the figure raised a hand and pointed directly at them. Panic surged through them, and they ran back to the campsite, stumbling over roots and branches. When they reached the tents, they found the fire completely out, the embers cold. But the whistling had started again, only now it was coming from inside the clearing, impossibly close. That night, they huddled in their tents, too terrified to sleep. The whistling continued, until just before dawn, fading into the distance. When they finally mustered the courage to leave the next morning, they found deep, human-like footprints circling their tents, as though something had been walking around them all night. They never returned to Blackwood Forest again. Story 2: The Red Eyes of Cedar Hill Woods. In the small town of Cedar Hill, there was a patch of forest so dense and old that most locals avoided it, especially at night. It was known for strange sightings and unsettling stories, but no one could ever quite explain what made the woods feel so wrong. Some claimed they'd seen figures with glowing red eyes in the trees, while others whispered about the eerie sounds of children crying deep in the forest. David, a local high school student, didn't believe in any of the stories. He loved the outdoors and often went for late-night hikes with his friends. One autumn night, after a football game, he convinced two of his friends, Matt and Jess, to join him on a moonlit hike through Cedar Hill Woods. The night was cool, and a thick fog had rolled in, making the forest even more ominous. The trio followed a narrow trail, their flashlights casting long shadows on the gnarled tree trunks. The deeper they ventured into the woods, the more uneasy Jess became. "I don't know, guys. This place is giving me the creeps," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rustling leaves. Matt laughed it off. "You're just letting those dumb stories get to you." But David noticed it too, an unnatural stillness in the air. The forest was too quiet, as if the wildlife had disappeared. Then, They heard it. A soft, almost imperceptible sound, like someone crying. The sound was faint but unmistakable, echoing through the trees. David turned to his friends, his brow furrowed. "Did you guys hear that?" Jess nodded, her face pale. Matt tried to brush it off, but there was a tremor in his voice when he spoke. "Probably just the wind." The crying continued, growing louder and more distinct. It wasn't the wind. It was a child, sobbing somewhere in the darkness. Against their better judgment, they followed the sound, leaving the trail behind. The fog thickened, and their flashlights barely penetrated the gloom. As they pushed deeper into the woods, they began to see movement in their peripheral vision, dark shapes darting between the trees. David's heart raced, but he pressed on, determined to find the source of the crying. Finally, they came to a small clearing. That's when they saw them. Perched in the trees, barely visible through the fog, were a pair of glowing red eyes. They were large, unblinking, and fixed directly on the trio. The crying stopped abruptly, replaced by a low, guttural growl that sent a wave of dread through David's body. Jess screamed, stumbling backward while Matt froze in place, his face pale as death. The creature, whatever it was, didn't move from its perch, but the air around them grew thick with malice. The red eyes seemed to burn into their souls. "Run!" David whispered, his voice barely working. They bolted back the way they came, their hearts pounding, lungs burning. The growl echoed behind them, and though they never saw the creature give chase, they could feel its presence, like a shadow following them through the trees. They didn't stop running until they burst out of the woods and into the safety of the town. None of them spoke about what they saw, but the image of those red eyes haunted their nightmares for weeks. Years later, David still refuses to set foot in Cedar Hill Woods after dark. He knows something evil lurks there, and it's waiting for anyone foolish enough to return. Story 3. The Hollow Man of Pine Creek. In 1998, a group of friends, Tom, Sarah, and Ben, set out for a weekend of camping in Pine Creek National Forest. The forest, known for its vast expanse of trees and deep winding trails, was a favorite among hikers and campers. The trio had heard tales about strange sightings in the forest, but like most, they brushed them off as exaggerated campfire stories. The first night was uneventful. They pitched their tents near a creek and spent the evening stargazing. The second night, however, things took a sinister turn. Around midnight, Sarah woke to a strange noise just outside the tent. It wasn't an animal. This was a rhythmic, hollow knocking sound, like wood being struck. She listened closely, trying to figure out where it was coming from. Then she heard it. A soft whisper, almost too quiet to make out. "Sarah." She froze, her heart pounding. The voice was distant, but it clearly called her name. She shook Tom and Ben awake, telling them about the noise. They listened, but the forest had fallen silent. Just as they were about to dismiss it, the knocking resumed, louder this time and closer. It echoed through the trees, each knock sending a jolt of fear through their bodies. Then they heard the whisper again, closer now. "Sarah!" "Who's out there?" Tom yelled, stepping out of the tent with a flashlight. He shone the light around, but there was nothing, only the dense wall of trees and the stillness of the forest. Suddenly, Ben gasped, pointing toward the tree line. Standing just beyond the reach of their flashlight was a tall, thin figure. It was unnaturally pale, its limbs long and spindly, like it had been stretched. Its eyes were hollow, black voids that seemed to suck in the light. Without a word, the three of them bolted toward the car. The figure didn't move, but they could feel its empty gaze following them as they ran. The knocking sound continued, faster and more frantic, like something was trying to get in. They reached the car and sped away, leaving the campsite behind. None of them ever spoke of the Hollow Man again, but they all knew something unnatural lived in Pine Creek, and it was waiting for them to return.